In winter 1944, an Austrian soldier named Otto Ludwig sat in his barracks at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, surrounded by men who wanted him dead. Not American guards, but fellow German prisoners who had decided that speaking one sentence of truth made him a traitor, deserving execution, and over the next weeks those men would beat him and starve him and threaten him with the same fate that had befallen dozens of other prisoners across America who dared question Nazi ideology while living in camps supposedly run by Americans, but actually controlled by the same fascist terror that had consumed Germany, revealing the shocking reality that the United States government had accidentally created perfect conditions for Nazis to run their own miniature police state inside democratic America, complete with secret courts and brutal enforcers and murdered victims whose deaths were labeled suicides by guards who either did not care or could not stop the violence happening right under their noses. I first heard about Otto Ludwig from a veteran named James Morrison, whose father had been a guard at Fort Robinson during the war years. Told me how his father spent decades haunted by what he witnessed in those camps, the systematic terror that Nazis inflicted on fellow prisoners while American authorities looked the other way or failed to understand what was happening because so few guards spoke German, and the whole system relied on German officers to maintain discipline among their own men, essentially handing control of the camps to the very ideology America was fighting to destroy. James said his father kept a journal that the family found after he died in 1989, pages filled with guilt about prisoners he knew were being tortured but could not protect. Names of men who disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances, and questions about why the Army cared more about Geneva Convention compliance than actually keeping human beings safe from each other. Fort Robinson in northwestern Nebraska near Crawford had been a cavalry post and remount depot before becoming a POW camp in 1943. Built to house 3,000 German prisoners captured in North Africa and Europe, the same ground where Crazy Horse had been killed and Cheyenne had been massacred, now serving as comfortable captivity for enemy soldiers who would be fed well and treated humanely according to international law. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required the United States to provide living quarters comparable to American military facilities, adequate food and medical care, opportunities for recreation and education, protection from violence and intimidation, respect for military rank and customs, basically ensuring that captured enemy combatants lived better than many American civilians dealing with wartime rationing and shortages. The first prisoners arrived at Fort Robinson in November 1943, 600 veterans of Rommel's Africa Corps. Battle-hardened soldiers captured after the North African campaign collapsed, shipped across the Atlantic and west to Nebraska to wait out a war they had already lost. They marched from the train station to the camp in perfect military formation despite being prisoners, maintaining the discipline and bearing that had made the Africa Corps legendary. Their khaki desert uniforms and peaked caps looking strange against the Nebraska prairie landscape as local residents lined the streets watching enemy soldiers parade through their small town. But what nobody understood at the time was that roughly 30% of those prisoners were hardcore Nazis, true believers in Hitler's ideology, who had not given up despite military defeats. Men who saw captivity as temporary setback rather than final outcome, and who intended to maintain Nazi discipline and loyalty among fellow prisoners regardless of what Americans tried to do. These men quickly identified each other through subtle signals and coded conversations, formed networks of control that operated beneath the surface of official camp life, established themselves as the real authority that other prisoners had to answer to if they wanted to avoid being labeled traitors or cowards or enemies of the Reich. The American military made a catastrophic decision that enabled this Nazi control to flourish unchecked. Article 43 of the Geneva Convention allowed prisoners to appoint their own administrators, and the Army decided to rely on German officers and NCOs to maintain discipline rather than using American guards for everything. A choice that seemed efficient and compliant with international law, but that effectively handed day-to-day control of camp life to the very men most committed to Nazi ideology. Senior German officers became camp commandants in all but name, woke their own men for roll call, marched them to meals, organized work details, enforced barracks rules, wielding power that they used to recreate a miniature version of Nazi Germany inside American territory. Then something unexpected happened that revealed just how dangerous this system was. I welcome you to today's story. This is a channel for authentic World War II stories where ordinary people were pushed into moments that tested their fear, courage, and humanity. My name is Dr. Franklin J. Carter. I'm 80 years old, a retired military veteran, and I have been telling war stories for many years. If you are ready to follow me through these stories of war, then kindly like this video, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications so you can see other episodes when they're released. Also, tell me where you are watching from and what exact time you are watching right now. This story is just starting, so sit down and follow me to the end. Within months of the camps filling up, prisoners started dying under suspicious circumstances, bodies found hanging in barracks or latrines. Injuries that looked like beatings or torture being explained away as accidents or self-inflicted wounds, a pattern of violence that suggested organized elimination of people who threatened Nazi control rather than random tragedies. Between September 1943 and April 1944, across all American POW camps, there were 6 confirmed murders, 2 forced suicides, 43 voluntary suicides, 1 general camp riot, and hundreds of localized acts of violence, numbers that horrified Army investigators once they started paying attention, but that represented only the incidents they knew about. The reality was far worse, according to historians who studied the camps decades later. Most prisoner suicides were likely murders disguised to look self-inflicted, carried out through a process that Nazis called the Holy Ghost, a term for secret executions that left no obvious evidence of who was responsible. Prisoners would be tried in kangaroo courts held after lights out, accused of disloyalty or cooperating with Americans, or criticizing Hitler, convicted by Nazi officers acting as judges, then killed by enforcers who made the deaths look like the victim had hanged himself or suffered an accident. Other prisoners knew what had happened, but were too terrified to speak up, understanding that reporting Nazi violence would make them the next victim. Silence enforced through fear that was more effective than any American regulation. Otto Ludwig learned about this terror firsthand when he made the mistake of speaking honestly about his beliefs during a barracks discussion in early 1944. He was Austrian rather than German, from Vienna, where he had grown up skeptical of Nazi ideology despite being conscripted into the Wehrmacht when Austria was annexed, fought because he had no choice but never believed in the cause. Captured in North Africa along with thousands of others when the Afrika Korps finally collapsed under Allied pressure. At Fort Robinson, he watched hardcore Nazis assert control over camp life, saw them intimidate other prisoners and enforce loyalty oaths, and punish anyone who showed friendliness toward American guards, the whole system making him sick with the realization that he had escaped Nazi Germany only to end up in a Nazi-controlled camp thousands of miles away in supposedly free America. You won't believe what Otto said that sealed his fate. During a conversation about what would happen after the war, surrounded by other prisoners in the barracks one evening, he stated clearly that if Germany won the war, he would never return there, and if Germany lost it, he would deliver the Nazis to the knife, meaning he would help bring Nazi leaders to justice for what they had done. The words hung in the air for a moment before several prisoners moved away from him, their faces showing fear of being associated with such open disloyalty, while others stared at him with expressions that promised retribution for speaking treason against the Reich. The attacks started that same night, according to James Morrison's father's journal. 3 prisoners cornered Otto in the latrine after evening count, punched him in the stomach and kidneys while hissing threats in German about what happened to traitors, left him gasping on the floor while they walked away as if nothing had occurred. When Otto reported the assault to an American guard, the guard shrugged and said, "Prisoner disputes were handled by German officers per camp regulations. Go talk to the barracks leader if you have a problem." Completely missing that the barracks leader was one of the hardcore Nazis who had ordered the beating in the first place. Over the following weeks, the abuse escalated into systematic torture designed to break Otto's will and make an example of what happened to prisoners who questioned Nazi authority. His food rations were stolen before he could eat them, leaving him constantly hungry while watching other prisoners receive adequate meals. His bunk was sabotaged, so he would fall during the night, injuries blamed on his own clumsiness. Other prisoners were ordered not to speak to him, enforced isolation that cut him off from any support or friendship, made him a ghost in the barracks despite being physically present. The message was clear to everyone watching: speak against the Nazis, and this is what happens to you. Better to keep your mouth shut and survive than stand up for truth and suffer. But the psychological torture was worse than the physical abuse. Nazi enforcers would stand near Otto during roll call whispering about the Holy Ghost, how it came for traitors in the night, how bodies were found hanging, and nobody ever learned who was responsible, how easy it would be for an Austrian who did not belong among real Germans to have a fatal accident that American guards would believe was suicide. They described in detail how other prisoners had been killed in camps across America, the methods used to make murder look like self-inflicted death. The certainty that no one would be punished because Americans did not care what happened to Germans, as long as it happened quietly, without causing problems for camp administration. The breaking point came when Nazi leaders held a secret trial after lights out, assembled prisoners in the back of the barracks while Otto was pulled from his bunk and forced to stand before them. Accused of treason against Germany and disloyalty to the Führer and spreading defeatism among the ranks, crimes that normally carried death sentences under military law. The proceedings were conducted with all the formality of real courts-martial, despite having no legal authority, Nazi officers acting as prosecutors and judges, prisoner witnesses testifying that Otto had spoken against Germany and praised America. The whole performance designed to legitimize whatever punishment they decided to inflict. Otto defended himself the only way he could, by telling the truth, even though he knew it would make everything worse. He said he was Austrian, not German. His country had been invaded and annexed against the will of many citizens. He had been conscripted into an army, fighting for ideology. He despised being captured was the best thing that ever happened to him, because it meant he did not have to kill for Hitler anymore. He said the war was lost, and everyone in this barracks knew it. Germany was being destroyed from east and west. Clinging to Nazi fantasy would not change reality. The sooner they accepted defeat, the sooner they could start rebuilding something better than what Hitler had created. The Nazi judges deliberated for maybe 10 minutes before announcing their verdict. Guilty on all charges, sentenced to be carried out by barracks enforcers at their discretion, which everyone understood meant Otto would be beaten severely and possibly killed, depending on how much the Nazis thought they could get away with before American guards intervened. The trial ended with prisoners returning to their bunks in silence. Otto left standing alone, knowing that attack was coming soon, guards outside the barracks completely unaware that a fascist court system was operating under their noses while they worried about preventing escapes and maintaining perimeter security. Then something unexpected happened that probably saved Otto's life, even though it revealed how badly the American camp system had failed. An American corporal named Robert Chen, who had been walking perimeter duty, noticed unusual activity in Otto's barracks after lights out, saw shadows moving, and heard voices when everyone should have been sleeping, decided to investigate despite regulations saying prisoner discipline was handled by German officers. He opened the barracks door to find Otto on the floor surrounded by 4 prisoners holding improvised weapons, boards taken from supply areas, belts that could be used for strangling, the scene making clear that serious violence was about to occur. Corporal Chen ordered everyone back to their bunks immediately, helped Otto to his feet, and escorted him to the camp infirmary, despite protests from German prisoners that this was internal German military discipline that Americans had no authority to interfere with. The medic on duty examined Otto and found extensive bruising from earlier beatings, signs of malnutrition from food being stolen, evidence of ongoing physical abuse that should have been noticed weeks earlier, if anyone had been paying attention. Chen filed an incident report describing what he had witnessed, triggering an investigation that finally exposed how Nazis were terrorizing fellow prisoners while camp administration remained oblivious. The investigation revealed a system of control so elaborate and ruthless that it shocked even experienced army officers who thought they understood POW camp dynamics. Nazi leaders had established complete social hierarchy within the barracks, with hardcore believers at the top wielding absolute authority, regular Wehrmacht soldiers in the middle trying to avoid notice, and anti-Nazis at the bottom living in constant fear of violence. They published an underground newsletter called Die Mahnung, meaning the admonition that spread Nazi propaganda and listed prisoners who were suspected of disloyalty, essentially marking targets for harassment or worse. They controlled access to camp privileges like canteen purchases and recreational activities, rewarding loyalty and punishing dissent through a system that operated parallel to official camp rules. Most disturbing was evidence of the Holy Ghost murders that investigators could not fully prove but strongly suspected. Multiple prisoners had died under circumstances that looked suspicious once examined closely, hanging deaths where the positioning of bodies suggested someone else had been involved, supposed accidents that seemed implausible given the details, beatings severe enough to cause internal injuries that went unreported until prisoners died days later. Witnesses would not testify out of fear for their own safety. Physical evidence had been cleaned up or destroyed. The whole system designed to make proving murder nearly impossible while maintaining enough deniability that camp officials could claim deaths were self-inflicted or accidental. James Morrison's father wrote in his journal that the investigation made him realize how completely the Army had failed in its duty to protect prisoners from each other. How the Geneva Convention's well-meaning provisions about respecting military hierarchy had been exploited by Nazis to run terror campaigns that American guards either did not see or chose to ignore because addressing the problem would mean admitting systemic failure. He wrote that Otto Ludwig was just one victim who happened to survive because one guard paid attention at the right moment. But how many others had been killed or tortured while guards walked past their barracks never knowing what was happening inside? How many men died believing America would protect them, only to learn that Nazis controlled their lives even in captivity, thousands of miles from Germany? Otto was transferred to another camp within days, moved for his protection to a facility that had better screening procedures and more active monitoring of internal prisoner dynamics. His departure from Fort Robinson was both relief and an acknowledgement of defeat, since removing the victim was easier than confronting the perpetrators who remained in control of their barracks. American authorities never prosecuted the Nazis who had tortured Otto, never held a trial for the secret court-martial they had conducted, never punished the enforcers who had been moments away from seriously injuring or killing him when Corporal Chen intervened. The whole incident quietly swept aside as internal German matter that Americans preferred not to examine too closely. But Otto's story was not unique. Just one example of pattern playing out in camps across America during 1944 and 1945, as Army investigators slowly realized that Nazi control was far more extensive and violent than anyone had imagined. At Camp Hearn in Texas, a prisoner named Hugo Kraus, who worked as interpreter and openly criticized the Third Reich, was beaten to death with pipes and sticks and boards studded with nails by 7 Nazi enforcers who cracked his skull and broke both arms, and caused lacerations so severe that he died 6 days later despite medical treatment. Not one person in his barracks of 60 men came to his aid during the attack, all of them too terrified of becoming next victim to intervene while fellow prisoner was murdered in front of them. The Kraus murder was so brutal and undeniable that authorities had to respond, leading to court-martial that convicted the attackers and sent them to prison, but even then, justice was incomplete. One attacker named Gunther Meisel confessed to the crime and served time in American prison before President Harry Truman paroled him in 1949, along with the other convicted killers, allowing them to return to Germany just 4 years after murdering a fellow prisoner. The light punishment sending message that Nazi violence in camps would not be taken seriously, even when it resulted in confirmed deaths. Across America, similar patterns emerged as investigators looked closer at suspicious prisoner deaths. In Arizona, 7 U-boat crewmen hanged a fellow submariner who had been working as informant, strangling him and staging the scene to look like suicide before American guards discovered the truth. In Arkansas, a prisoner was beaten to death for working harder than required on farm detail, his crime being too cooperative with American employers in ways that made other prisoners look bad by comparison. In South Carolina, a prisoner was strangled over rumors he favored Americans, killed based on suspicion and gossip rather than any confirmed disloyalty. Catholic priests were severely beaten for not embracing Nazism, their religious objections to Nazi ideology making them targets for violence that left them hospitalized. The weapons prisoners used revealed how determined Nazis were to maintain terror despite having limited resources in captivity. They fought with boards taken from work areas and studded with nails stolen from supply sheds, improvised weapons that could inflict terrible damage. They used razor blades hidden in various places to cut enemies during fights, the small weapons easily concealed and deployed. They fashioned garrotes from belts and wire for strangling victims quietly, methods that left minimal evidence and could be passed off as suicide by hanging if bodies were arranged properly. The creativity of their violence showed organized planning rather than spontaneous outbursts, systematic elimination of threats to Nazi control rather than random conflicts between individuals. Then something even more disturbing emerged from investigation documents, revealing just how badly American administrators had misunderstood what they were dealing with. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners salute and show military courtesy according to their own army's customs, and American authorities accepted what hardcore Nazis told them was standard Wehrmacht protocol, including celebrations of Nazi holidays and displays of party symbols and use of Nazi salutes, even after these had been banned in some camps, essentially allowing fascist rituals to continue in American territory because guards thought they were respecting military tradition rather than enabling political indoctrination. Nazi officers appointed as camp administrators under Article 43 used their authority to control every aspect of prisoner life in ways Americans never intended. They assigned barracks positions to ensure loyalists roomed together and could monitor suspicious prisoners, creating surveillance networks that reported any anti-Nazi statements or behavior. They controlled work detail assignments, sending cooperators to easy jobs and punishing dissenters with hardest labor in worst conditions. They managed canteen access, allowing loyalists to purchase extras while denying dissidents basic privileges, economic pressure that reinforced social hierarchy and punished nonconformity. Most insidious was Nazi control of cultural and educational activities that were supposed to denazify prisoners through exposure to democratic values. The intellectual diversion program spent millions on films and books and classes designed to convert prisoners away from fascism. But Nazis appointed to run camp libraries hid books that had been banned by the Third Reich. Prisoners assigned to educational programs screened out anti-Nazi content. Film screenings became optional, so hardcore believers simply did not attend showings of movies meant to promote American values. The whole re-education effort failed because Americans allowed Nazis to control the mechanisms of their own denazification, like asking wolves to teach lambs about vegetarianism and wondering why it did not work. The underground newsletter Die Meinung became primary tool for spreading Nazi propaganda and maintaining ideological control despite American efforts to promote democracy. Published secretly by prisoners with access to camp printing equipment, distributed through networks that evaded guard supervision, the newsletter reminded readers that Germany would ultimately triumph, that loyalty to the Führer was sacred duty even in captivity, that traitors would be punished now or after the war when true Germans returned home victorious. Each issue listed names of suspected collaborators or defeatists, essentially creating hit lists that marked prisoners for harassment or violence, the whole system operating openly while American guards who could not read German remained ignorant of content being distributed under their noses. Corporal Robert Chen, who had saved Otto Ludwig, wrote letters to his family describing the frustration of guards who wanted to stop Nazi violence, but were prevented by regulations and language barriers and command decisions that prioritized smooth camp operations over prisoner safety. He wrote about watching prisoners he knew were being intimidated or threatened, unable to intervene because official policy said internal German discipline was handled by German officers. The circular logic trapping guards in system where they were responsible for security but not allowed to address actual threats. He wrote about guards who spoke no German trying to supervise prisoners conducting all business in a language they could not understand. The obvious intelligence disadvantage putting Americans at mercy of whatever prisoners chose to tell them. The guard quality problem was even worse than language barriers. POW camp duty was considered lowest priority assignment in the Army, staffed by men who had been rejected for combat or other essential roles, what one officer described as dredging the bottom of the barrel for personnel nobody else wanted. Some guards were physically unfit for regular service, others had psychological issues that should have disqualified them from any military duty, many lacked basic training in security procedures or prisoner management. All of them were assigned to camps where they were supposed to control thousands of enemy soldiers, despite being the least qualified personnel available. Maxwell McKnight, who served as camp administrator in Kentucky, said that guards included all sorts of kooks and wacky people who would never have been trusted with combat roles. Men who treated their assignment as vacation from real war, who fraternized inappropriately with prisoners or failed to maintain security protocols, who could not be bothered to learn even basic German phrases that would have helped them understand what prisoners were discussing. The personnel quality meant that even when guards witnessed suspicious behavior, they often lacked judgment to recognize it as serious threat. Missed warning signs that more experienced soldiers would have caught allowed problems to escalate because they did not understand prisoner dynamics or did not care enough to investigate unusual situations. Then something happened in May 1945 that changed everything about Nazi control in American camps, but came too late for victims who had already been killed or terrorized. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe ended. Suddenly prisoners could no longer cling to fantasy that Germany might still win, and those who had remained loyal to Hitler had to confront reality that they had fought for regime that brought total destruction to their nation. American authorities ordered mandatory screenings of films documenting Nazi concentration camps and atrocities, forced every prisoner to watch evidence of what their government had done. The horrified and disbelieving reactions, exposing how many had genuinely not known about Holocaust or had dismissed reports as enemy propaganda. The mandatory film screenings created divisions within camp populations between prisoners who accepted the evidence and those who insisted it was Allied fabrication. Hardcore Nazis trying to maintain their denialism, while growing numbers of regular Wehrmacht soldiers expressed shame and disgust at what they were learning. Some prisoners who had enforced Nazi discipline suddenly backed away from overt displays of loyalty. not wanting to be associated with regime that had committed such crimes, the social dynamic shifting as evidence made continuing Hitler worship indefensible to all but most committed true believers. But for Otto Ludwig, and others who had suffered Nazi violence during their captivity, Germany's defeat brought no justice for what had been done to them in American camps. Investigations into Holy Ghost murders and systematic torture were incomplete and inconclusive. Most perpetrators never identified or charged, the few who were prosecuted receiving light sentences that were further reduced through pardons and early releases. The American government seemed more interested in forgetting the embarrassing reality that Nazis had run terror campaigns on U.S. soil than in fully accounting for crimes committed and punishing those responsible. Preference for moving on, rather than confronting difficult truths about how badly the camp system had failed. Lieutenant Colonel Leon Jaworski, who would later become famous as Watergate's special prosecutor, was assigned to prosecute German POWs for murdering fellow prisoners, bringing court-martial charges against 15 men in secret military tribunals that Americans wanted to keep quiet. Jaworski won most of his cases, proved through witness testimony and physical evidence that specific prisoners had killed or beaten others, secured convictions and death sentences for worst offenders. But even these successful prosecutions represented a tiny fraction of actual violence that had occurred, focusing on undeniable murders while ignoring countless beatings and torture, and intimidation that did not result in deaths or left evidence that could survive investigation. The Holy Ghost process had been too effective at concealing responsibility for murders, making comprehensive accountability nearly impossible years after crimes occurred. Witnesses who might have testified were scattered across different camps or had been repatriated to Germany. Physical evidence had been lost or destroyed, the passage of time making it hard to reconstruct exactly what had happened in which barracks on which nights, all working against efforts to identify and punish everyone who had participated in secret executions of fellow prisoners. Historians who studied the camps later estimated that dozens of prisoners were likely murdered through Holy Ghost process, their deaths labeled as suicides in official records, despite strong suspicion that they had been killed for opposing Nazi authority. James Morrison spent years trying to learn what happened to Otto Ludwig after his transfer from Fort Robinson. Wanting to know whether the man his father had helped rescue survived the war and rebuilt his life, or became another casualty of system that failed to protect prisoners from each other. The records were incomplete and contradictory, transfers not well documented, prisoner movements across hundreds of camps creating confusion that made tracking individuals nearly impossible decades later. Some documents suggested Otto had been sent to segregation camp, where anti-Nazi prisoners were separated from hardcore believers, a belated recognition that mixing the groups created dangerous situations, but there was no confirmation about what happened to him after 1945, when prisoners began repatriating to Europe. The absence of information about Otto's fate became metaphor for larger failure to acknowledge what had happened in American POW camps during the war. Victims of Nazi violence were forgotten, their suffering dismissed as internal German matters that Americans had no responsibility for. Attention focused on positive stories about re-education success and prisoners who became friends with guards and returned to America as immigrants after the war. The narrative that Americans wanted to remember was about humane treatment of enemy combatants and compliance with Geneva Convention, not about Nazis running kangaroo courts and murdering fellow prisoners, while guards who could not speak German looked the other way. But the truth was documented in journals like the one James Morrison's father kept, in incident reports filed by conscientious guards like Corporal Chen, who intervened when they saw violence. In court-martial transcripts of prosecutions against confirmed murderers, in letters that prisoners sent describing fear and intimidation they experienced from fellow captives. The evidence showed systematic failure of camp administration to understand that treating prisoners humanely meant protecting them not just from American abuse, but from abuse by each other. that respecting Geneva Convention required active monitoring of internal prisoner dynamics rather than passive reliance on German officers to police themselves. The Austrian identity aspect of Otto's persecution revealed particular cruelty in how hardcore Nazis enforced their ideology. Austria had been annexed by Germany in 1938. Many Austrians opposed the Anschluss, but were forced to accept German rule. Austrian soldiers were conscripted into Wehrmacht and expected to fight with same loyalty as ethnic Germans, even though some resented being forced to serve Hitler. In POW camps, Nazis treated Austrian prisoners with suspicion and contempt, questioning their commitment to Reich, assuming they were less reliable than real Germans, targeting them for harassment and violence if they showed any hint of preferring Austrian identity over German nationalism. This discrimination meant that Austrian prisoners like Otto faced double jeopardy, suffering because they were German military captives, but also because they were not German enough for Nazis who controlled camp life. Trapped between two worlds and belonging fully to neither, vulnerable to violence from fellow prisoners who saw Austrian identity as inherent disloyalty to greater German cause. Some Austrians coped by hiding their origins and pretending to be German. Others formed support networks with fellow Austrians who understood their situation. But those like Otto who openly maintained Austrian identity and criticized German nationalism marked themselves as targets in a system where conformity was essential for survival. The Geneva Convention's provisions that enabled Nazi control were well-intentioned attempts to maintain military discipline and respect prisoner dignity. But they failed to account for ideological movements that used military structure to advance totalitarian goals, rather than simply maintaining order. The convention assumed that military officers from any nation would act professionally and humanely toward their own men, did not anticipate that Nazi officers would see captivity as opportunity to maintain party control and eliminate dissent, treated military rank as neutral organizational category, rather than recognizing how fascism had corrupted traditional military structures into tools of political indoctrination and terror. American administrators who designed camp policies based on Geneva Convention requirements made reasonable assumptions that turned out to be catastrophically wrong. They assumed that German officers would maintain discipline in ways that benefited all prisoners rather than enforcing Nazi ideology, that prisoners would settle disputes through normal military channels rather than secret courts and violence, that cultural activities like films and classes would naturally promote democratic values rather than being subverted by Nazis who controlled access. Every assumption reflected democratic mindset that could not fully grasp how totalitarian systems corrupt every institution they touch, turning even provisions meant to protect dignity into mechanisms for extending control. The segregation camps established later in the war to separate hardcore Nazis from anti-Nazi prisoners were admission that original camp policies had failed, but they came too late for victims who had already been killed or tortured. Moving known Nazis to separate facilities reduced violence, but did not address fundamental problem that American authorities had never developed effective methods for identifying who was genuinely dangerous versus who was just regular Wehrmacht soldier trying to survive captivity. The screening procedures were crude and often inaccurate, relying on prisoner accusations that could be driven by personal grudges, on American officer assessments based on limited interaction, on German records that might list someone as Nazi party member without indicating level of commitment or willingness to use violence. Corporal Chen was transferred out of Fort Robinson in late 1945 after the camp closed, and prisoners were distributed to other facilities for processing and repatriation. He left the army shortly after war ended, returned to civilian life, trying to forget what he had seen, but haunted by memories of prisoners he could not save, by knowledge that his intervention had protected Otto Ludwig, but had done nothing to prevent system that allowed Nazi violence to flourish. In letters to his son James, written decades later, Chen expressed guilt about not doing more to expose the problem earlier, about filing reports that were read and filed away without prompting changes, about watching helplessly as prisoners lived in fear while American commanders prioritized smooth camp operations over moral duty to protect human beings in their custody. The Holy Ghost murders continued until Germany surrendered, according to investigation timelines, suggesting that even as Allied victory became obvious and Nazi ideology was discredited by battlefield defeats, hardcore believers maintained their terror campaigns against fellow prisoners who questioned loyalty to the Führer. The persistence of violence despite changing military circumstances showed how deeply committed true believers were to Nazi cause, how willing they were to kill fellow Germans for ideological purity, even when that ideology had led their nation to ruin. The fanatic devotion outlasting any rational basis for continued faith in Hitler's promises or Germany's prospects. The process of repatriating prisoners after Germany surrendered took over a year, complicated by destroyed infrastructure in Europe and need to investigate prisoners for potential war crimes before releasing them. Many prisoners were sent to Britain or France to work on reconstruction before final return to Germany, using their labor to repair damage that German military had inflicted during occupation years, a kind of rough justice that made them contribute to rebuilding what they had helped destroy. The delay meant that prisoners lived in American camps through all of 1945 and into 1946, no longer active enemies, but defeated soldiers waiting to return to uncertain futures in a nation that barely existed anymore. During those final months in camps, the internal dynamic shifted as prisoners confronted what would happen when they went home. The destruction of German cities, the occupation by Allied forces, the complete collapse of economy and social structures, the reality that many families were dead or displaced or living in ruins. Some prisoners who had enforced Nazi discipline became targets themselves as the tables turned, former victims taking revenge on those who had made their captivity miserable. American guards struggling to maintain order as camps became scenes of score settling and recrimination between prisoners who no longer had ideological war to unite them. Then something unexpected happened that revealed how mixed the legacy of American POW camps would be. Some prisoners who had been well treated decided to return to America as immigrants after rebuilding some stability in Germany, got American sponsors and emigrated legally, built lives in the country that had held them as enemy captives because they saw more opportunity and freedom in United States than in devastated homeland. A few who came back settled near the camps where they had been held, strange full-circle journey from prisoner to immigrant to citizen in communities that had once viewed them as dangerous enemies, requiring armed guards and barbed wire. James Morrison finally found Otto Ludwig in 2003 through Austrian military records and a determined research effort that took 3 years. Discovered that Otto had survived the war and returned to Vienna where he lived until his death in 1998 at age 76, spent 5 decades as a schoolteacher educating young Austrians about the dangers of fascism and the importance of speaking truth even when silence would be safer. Otto's daughter, Maria, told James that her father rarely discussed his POW camp experiences, but near the end of his life, he said that being tortured by fellow prisoners for opposing Nazis taught him that moral courage matters most when the cost is highest, that silence in the face of evil is complicity, regardless of personal danger. That his suffering had meaning because it proved that not all German soldiers embraced Hitler's ideology, even when doing so would have made their lives easier. Otto returned to Fort Robinson in 1995 at age 73, his only visit to the place where he had nearly been killed. Walked through the state park with a guide who did not know his history, stood in the area where his barracks had been, and wept for the first time in 50 years about what had happened to him there. He told the guide afterward that he had come to make peace with the place, to remember not just his suffering, but also Corporal Chen's courage in saving him, to acknowledge that even in systems that fail badly, There are individuals who choose to do right despite institutional pressure to look away. That Chen's intervention had given him 53 more years of life, that he used to teach students about resisting tyranny and protecting human dignity. Corporal Robert Chen lived until 2001. Never knew that Otto had survived until his son James tracked down the information 2 years after Chen's death, carried guilt about the prisoners he could not save without ever learning that the one he did save had lived a full and meaningful life. James arranged for Otto's daughter Maria to receive his grandfather's journal, the pages documenting Otto's persecution and rescue becoming family treasure that connected two families across continents and generations. The bond formed through one moment of courage in 1944, lasting long after both men were gone. The American military finally acknowledged the Nazi violence problem in 1998, when declassified documents led to public awareness and pressure for official recognition of what had happened in POW camps. A memorial was established at the National World War II Museum documenting the murders and systematic terror that Nazis inflicted on fellow prisoners, naming victims including Hugo Kraus and listing as unknown the dozens whose deaths were disguised as suicides. The belated acknowledgement providing some measure of validation for families who had spent decades knowing their loved ones were murdered, but having no official confirmation or justice. The lessons from Otto Ludwig's story became part of military training about prisoner management and the dangers of allowing any group to establish unchecked control over others. The failures of the World War II POW camps, studied as cautionary examples of how well-intentioned policies can enable the very evils they are meant to prevent. Modern detention facilities implement active monitoring and intervention protocols specifically designed to prevent the kind of internal terror campaigns that Nazis ran in American camps, the institutional learning coming too late for World War II victims, but potentially protecting future detainees from similar abuse. Maria Ludwig visited Corporal Chen's grave in 2005, placed flowers and a note thanking him for saving her father's life. Told James Morrison that Otto had always said the greatest gift one person can give another is protection in a moment of vulnerability, that Chen's willingness to intervene when he saw violence about to occur was the kind of everyday heroism that sustains civilization when institutions fail. She said her father taught her that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act rightly despite fear. That speaking truth and helping others are duties that do not disappear just because fulfilling them is difficult or dangerous. The story of Otto Ludwig and Nazi terror in American POW camps teaches that protecting human dignity requires constant vigilance and willingness to confront evil even when it operates within systems we trust. That good intentions and legal compliance are not enough without active enforcement and accountability. That individuals like Corporal Chen who choose to intervene make the difference between tragedy and survival for people whose lives depend on someone caring enough to act. If this story surprised you, if it made you think about things you hadn't considered, then give the video a thumbs up. Share it with somebody. Tell your friends. Tell your family. These stories matter. They're part of who we are. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more stories like this. I'm committed to researching deeply and also telling you what I witnessed during World War II. And if you've got stories of your own, stories about that war or any other time, write them down. Tell them to somebody. Don't let them disappear. History isn't just what's in books. It's what we remember, what we pass along, what we refuse to let die. Otto's courage in speaking against Nazis, Chen's courage in protecting him, and the 53 years Otto lived afterward teaching others to resist tyranny all demonstrate that moral witness and individual action matter profoundly even when larger systems fail. That one person choosing to do right can ripple across decades and continents. That the fight against evil is won not through grand strategies alone, but through countless small decisions by ordinary people who refuse to be bystanders when they see wrong being done. That is the truth Fort Robinson teaches, the lesson Otto Ludwig lived and Corporal Chen embodied. The legacy that survives long after both men are gone, and the camps are closed, and the barracks are torn down. A reminder that courage and compassion and willingness to protect the vulnerable are what make us human, even in the darkest times, when institutions designed to safeguard dignity instead enable its violation. Otto's legacy lives on through the thousands of students he taught over 5 decades, young people who learned from him that moral courage is not about being fearless, but about acting rightly. Despite fear, that protecting others is a fundamental human duty even when institutions fail to do so. That one person's choice to speak truth or intervene in violence can change lives and inspire others across generations to stand against tyranny.